October 14th, 1943. Schweinfurt, Germany. 0600 hours. 291 B-17 Flying Fortresses lifted off from airfields across England in the gray morning light, turned east, and began climbing toward Germany. They were going back to Schweinfurt. They had been to Schweinfurt once before, on August 17th, and that raid had cost them 36 aircraft and their crews. The analysts at 8th Air Force Headquarters had studied the bombing photographs and concluded that the damage to the ball-bearing factories was insufficient, that the factories needed to be hit again, harder, before German production could recover. So they were going back. The men who climbed into those B-17 on the morning of October 14th knew what Schweinfurt cost. They knew it not as a statistic but as an absence, the empty bunks, the unfinished letters, the specific silence left by 360 men who had not returned from August 17th. They strapped in, ran their pre-flight checks, and lifted off anyway, because that was the job, and the job did not include the option of refusing to go because the last time had been terrible. The P-47 Thunderbolts that escorted them flew as far as Aachen, roughly 200 miles east of England, still 150 miles short of Schweinfurt. At Aachen, the P-47s turned back. Their fuel gauges told them to. A P-47 flying escort at combat power had enough fuel to reach Aachen and return to England with a reserve. Beyond Aachen, the Thunderbolts would not make it home. They turned back. The B-17 flew on alone. The Luftwaffe had been waiting. German radar had tracked the formation from the moment it crossed the Dutch coast, and the fighter controllers at Luftwaffe Jagddivision headquarters had been directing aircraft to intercept positions for 90 minutes before the first engagement. When the P-47s turned back at Aachen, every Luftwaffe unit in the region knew exactly what that meant. The bombers were unescorted, and they would be unescorted for the 150 miles to Schweinfurt and the 150 miles back. 4 hours of unescorted flight over Germany. The Luftwaffe attacked in waves. The standard German tactic against unescorted B-17s was frontal assault, fighters coming head-on at closing speeds of 500 miles per hour, firing for the 2 or 3 seconds of effective range before breaking away below the bomber formation. Frontal attack required nerve and precision, but it had one overwhelming advantage. It hit the B-17 in its most vulnerable aspect, the nose, the cockpit, the pilots. A B-17 that lost both pilots was a B-17 that fell. The attacks continued for 4 hours. By the time the surviving B-17s crossed back over the Dutch coast and were met by their P-47 escorts, now able to fly the return leg, having landed and refueled while the bombers were deep in Germany, the losses were becoming visible in the sky. Not every aircraft that had survived to the Dutch coast would make it back to England. Some were losing altitude, some had feathered engines, some had wounded crew who were bleeding through the long flight back. 60 B-17 did not return at all. 60 aircraft, 600 men. That is a 26.5% loss rate, more than 1 in 4 of every aircraft that had taken off that morning. The standard military definition of an unacceptable loss rate, the threshold beyond which an Air Force cannot continue operations without destroying itself faster than it can replace losses, is roughly 5%. The 8th Air Force had just sustained a loss rate 5 times that. In 2 missions to Schweinfurt, it had lost 96 aircraft and close to 1,000 men. After October 14th, deep penetration daylight bombing over Germany was suspended. Not officially. Officially, the missions were being postponed due to weather, which was also true. The autumn weather over Europe had closed in. But the operational reality was that the 8th Air Force had run into the limits of what unescorted bombers could do against a defended target, and those limits had been written in fire over the skies of central Germany. The problem was specific, and it was not the bomber or its crew. The problem was the fighter escort. The problem was range. The problem was that no aircraft currently in the American inventory could accompany the bombers to the targets the strategic bombing campaign required and still have enough fuel to fight the German interceptors and return to England. Every fighter the United States Army Air Forces had was either fast enough and short-ranged or long-ranged and slow. The P-47 Thunderbolt was a superb fighter at altitude. Tough, heavily armed, effective against the Luftwaffe's best aircraft. it could reach Aachen. The P-38 Lightning had longer legs and could reach deeper into Germany. But the P-38 had mechanical problems in the cold of high-altitude European winter that its Pacific theater reputation had not prepared anyone for. The engines failed, the pilot's hands froze on the controls, the aircraft that had been devastating against Japanese fighters over the Pacific fell apart in the cold above Germany. There was a third option. It had been sitting in England since 1942, assigned to ground attack and reconnaissance roles because the men who could have used it had decided it was not suited for anything better. They were wrong. Its name was the P-51 Mustang, and it was about to become the most important aircraft of the air war over Europe. The P-51 Mustang was not designed to win the air war over Europe. It was designed to fulfill a British purchasing order in 117 days. In April 1940, the British Purchasing Commission, the organization responsible for acquiring aircraft from American manufacturers for the Royal Air Force, approached North American Aviation in Inglewood, California with a request. They needed a new fighter for the RAF, and they needed it quickly. North American had been building trainers and attack aircraft, not fighters, but the contract was worth having, and James Kindleberger, North American's president, believed his engineering team could build what the British wanted. He gave them 117 days. The team delivered a prototype in exactly 117 days. The design that emerged from this compressed timeline was remarkable in ways that its creators had not fully anticipated. A fighter with one of the cleanest aerodynamic profiles of any aircraft then flying. A low-drag laminar flow wing that reduced air resistance at high speeds in ways that conventional wing designs did not. An internal fuel capacity that gave it the kind of range that most contemporary fighters could not approach. The British called it the Mustang. They flew it, assessed it, and found its performance at low to medium altitudes, below 15,000 feet, genuinely impressive. At higher altitudes, the Mustang's performance was disappointing. The Allison V1710 engine that powered it had been designed for low-altitude work, and at the altitudes where the air war over Europe was actually fought, 25,000, 30,000 feet, the Allison engine wheezed. Power dropped off. Speed declined. The aircraft that had been fast and maneuverable at 10,000 feet became sluggish and outclassed at altitude. The British assessed it as a useful aircraft for ground attack and tactical reconnaissance. Not a fighter, not a high-altitude interceptor, certainly not an escort fighter capable of accompanying bombers deep into Germany. They assigned it to Army Cooperation Command, and it sat there, doing useful tactical work at low altitudes, while the strategic air war over Germany was being fought without it. In April 1942, a Rolls-Royce test pilot named Ronald Harker flew an Allison-powered Mustang at the company's test facilities at Duxford. He was impressed by the airframe, the clean lines, the smooth feel, the performance envelope at medium altitude that exceeded anything the RAF had in comparable roles. He was less impressed by the engine. The Allison was fine for what it was doing. Harker's professional judgment was that it was the wrong engine for this airframe, and that the right engine was sitting in every Spitfire and Hurricane that had been fighting over England since 1940. He wrote a report recommending that the Merlin be installed in the Mustang. Rolls-Royce fitted 5 Mustangs with the Merlin 61 engine. The result was not incremental improvement, it was transformation. The Merlin-powered Mustang reached 430 miles per hour at 30,000 feet. The Allison-powered version had managed approximately 415 miles per hour at 10,000 feet, and significantly less above that. The Merlin's 2-stage, 2-speed supercharger, a system that compressed the thin air at high altitude and fed it to the engine at effective pressure, gave the P-51 not just more power, but the right kind of power, sustained at the altitudes where the Luftwaffe and the bombers were actually fighting. The Allison ran out of air at altitude. The Merlin made its own. The difference was 90 miles per hour at 30,000 feet. 90 miles per hour was the difference between an aircraft that struggled to stay with bombers under attack and an aircraft that could catch anything the Luftwaffe was flying. American officers in England flew the Merlin-equipped prototypes. Their reports to Washington described an aircraft that matched or exceeded the Messerschmitt Bf-109G and the Focke-Wulf FW-190 in speed, in climb rate, and in sustained performance at altitude. In the dive, where the P-51's laminar flow wing produced speeds that no Luftwaffe fighter could match, nothing could catch it. The reports did not reach Washington quickly enough. The Army Air Force's Material Division in Dayton, Ohio had priorities, and the P-51 was not among them. The production lines for P-47s and P-38s were running. Contracts had been signed. Tooling had been set up. Switching resources to a new fighter program required the kind of bureaucratic momentum that organizational inertia resists. Every test flight of the Merlin Mustang produced numbers that should have forced a decision. They did not force it fast enough. The production line changes were approved slowly, against institutional resistance, driven primarily by the insistence of officers in England who had flown the aircraft and could not understand why the organization was arguing with results. The first P-51Bs reached England in November 1943. The 354th Fighter Group, the first unit equipped with them, flew its first escort mission on December 1, 1943, 7 weeks after 60 B-17s had not returned from Schweinfurt. The Luftwaffe would not recognize for several months what had arrived. The Merlin engine gave the P-51 speed and altitude performance. The drop tank gave it range. A drop tank was not a new concept. The idea of carrying additional fuel in external tanks that could be jettisoned when empty, or when the pilot needed to engage in combat and could not afford the drag, had been understood since the early days of aviation. The physics were simple. More fuel means more range, and if you no longer need the tank, you drop it and fly clean. The problem was not the concept. The problem was the institution. American air power doctrine in 1942 and early 1943 was built around the premise that the bomber would always get through, that a formation of B-17 with their combined defensive firepower of hundreds of .50 caliber machine guns could defeat fighter interception without escort. General Ira Eaker, commanding the 8th Air Force, believed in the doctrine. General Hap Arnold, commanding the Army Air Forces from Washington, believed in the doctrine. The doctrine said you did not need long-range escort fighters, and therefore you did not need the drop tanks that would give fighters the range the doctrine said they did not require. The Luftwaffe had not read the doctrine. The losses on the Regensburg-Schweinfurt raid in August 1943 raised questions. The losses on the second Schweinfurt raid in October answered them. The doctrine was wrong. Eaker began requesting drop tanks immediately after the August mission. He sent requests to Arnold. He sent requests to the logistics organizations responsible for theater supply. He pointed out that P-47s with 75-gallon drop tanks could reach significantly farther into Germany than P-47s without them, and that even this partial extension of escort range would reduce bomber losses by keeping the German fighters from attacking during the critical phase of the approach. The requests were processed. The supply chain moved. The tanks arrived in quantities insufficient for the scale of the operations being conducted. The bombers that flew in October 1943 flew with fighter escort that ended at Aachen because the tanks that would have allowed the escort to continue had not arrived in sufficient numbers. The 60 B-17s that did not return from Schweinfurt on October 14th were shot down, in significant part because a logistics and procurement failure had left the escort fighters without the fuel to accompany them. The P-51B changed the arithmetic of the drop tank problem in a specific way that made it more decisive than simply adding fuel. A P-51B with two 75-gallon drop tanks had a combat radius of approximately 550 miles. This was enough to reach Berlin from English bases and return. Not comfortably, the pilots who flew those missions described fuel management as a constant occupation, a running calculation of consumption against distance that required attention throughout the flight. But it was enough. A P-51B with two 108-gallon drop tanks, the larger tanks that came into service in early 1944, had a combat radius exceeding 600 miles. The P-51D, the variant that arrived in May 1944 with a bubble canopy that gave the pilot 360-degree visibility, carried enough fuel and wing tanks alone to reach Berlin without drop tanks, using the drop tanks to extend range further or to have full internal fuel when engaging. By the spring of 1944, a P-51 could accompany a B-17 from England to any target in Germany and fight the Luftwaffe over that target and return. The Luftwaffe did not believe this was possible. German fighter pilots in early 1944 were flying intercept missions based on a model of American air power that had been accurate in 1942 and 1943. The bombers flew deep, the escort fighters turned back at the German border, and the serious interception began when the unescorted bombers were over German territory. The German fighter controller system, the Himmelbett network of radar stations, command posts, and radio-directed interceptors that had been built since 1940, was optimized for this model. The first time a P-51 appeared over Berlin, the German controllers initially assumed it was a captured American aircraft being evaluated. A fighter with the range to escort bombers from England to Berlin and fight over the city was not in their threat model. Lieutenant General Adolf Galland, commanding Luftwaffe Fighter Arm 1, received the first report of P-51s over Berlin in February 1944. He later wrote that he had contacted the German fighter pilot who filed the report and asked him to confirm. The pilot confirmed. Galland took the report to Goering. Goering told him the pilot was mistaken. The pilot was not mistaken. On February 20th, 1944, the 8th Air Force launched what became known as Big Week, 6 days of continuous strategic bombing against German aircraft manufacturing facilities, supported by RAF night raids, combined with a deliberate shift in American fighter tactics that was more consequential than any individual bombing mission. The shift in tactics came from General James Doolittle, who had replaced Eaker as 8th Air Force commander in January 1944. Doolittle had observed what the P-51's capabilities made possible, and drawn a conclusion that the bomber escort doctrine had specifically prohibited. He told his fighter pilots to leave the bombers, not abandon them, not ignore them, but to understand that their primary mission was not to fly alongside the bombers as a defensive screen, absorbing German attacks and protecting each individual aircraft from each individual interceptor. Their primary mission was to destroy the Luftwaffe, and the way to destroy the Luftwaffe was not to wait for its aircraft to come to the bombers. It was to hunt them. P-51s with the range to reach any point in Germany could intercept Luftwaffe fighters as they were climbing to altitude, could attack Luftwaffe airfields on the way to the target and on the way home, could pursue retreating German aircraft back to their bases rather than breaking off at the German border to ensure enough fuel for the return to England. The P-47, bound to the immediate vicinity of the bombers by its fuel gauge, had been fighting a defensive battle, absorbing Luftwaffe attacks and attempting to protect the formation. The P-51, with its range and its speed and its altitude performance, could fight an offensive one. Doolittle gave the order. The P-51s spread out from the bomber formations and went hunting. Big Week was the proof of what this meant. In 6 days of continuous operations beginning February 20th, American and British bombers struck the aircraft manufacturing facilities at Regensburg, Augsburg, Gotha, Schweinfurt, Leipzig, and a dozen other locations across Germany. The loss rate on the bomber formations was still significant. Precision bombing from altitude over Germany was never without cost, and the Luftwaffe fought back hard in those 6 days. But the P-51 escorts were not standing beside the bombers anymore. They were ranging across the sky, attacking German interceptors before they could reach altitude, chasing them back to their airfields, shooting them down over their own territory. The Luftwaffe's fundamental defensive problem was this: it could not avoid the engagement. The bombers were attacking targets that Germany could not allow to be destroyed: the aircraft factories, the oil refineries, the synthetic fuel plants, the ball-bearing facilities. Every time the bombers came, the Luftwaffe had to respond, because the alternative was to allow the factories to burn and the production to stop. The fighters had to come up and fight, and when they came up and fought over Germany in the spring of 1944, the P-51s were waiting. In March 1944, the Luftwaffe lost 511 fighter pilots killed. That is 21.7% of its available pilot strength, more than 1 in 5 experienced pilots in a single month. These were not replacement pilots with 50 hours of flight time. These were the men who had been flying since the Battle of Britain, who had accumulated the skills through 4 years of combat that separated the excellent from the merely adequate. The replacement pilots who would fill their places had 100 hours, perhaps 200, against Luftwaffe squadron averages that have been measured in thousands. In April 1944, another 447 Luftwaffe pilots were killed. By the end of April 1944, 6 weeks before D-Day, the Luftwaffe had essentially ceased offensive operations over Western Europe. Its fighter force still existed on paper. The aircraft were still being manufactured, in numbers that continued to increase even as the pilot losses mounted. But the men who could fly those aircraft effectively, who could execute the interception tactics that had made Schweinfurt possible, who could lead the aggressive frontal attacks against bomber formations with the precision those attacks required, those men were dead or captured at a rate that training could not replace. The P-51 had not destroyed the Luftwaffe's aircraft. It had destroyed its pilots. And without experienced pilots, aircraft were aluminum shapes waiting to be destroyed by the next wave of P-51 escorts. There is a detail about the P-51 Mustang that almost no popular history of the aircraft includes. The American Army Air Force's Material Division classified the P-51B as unsuitable for air superiority roles in March 1943. The aircraft that destroyed the Luftwaffe, that made D-Day possible, that ensured the strategic bombing campaign could continue until the synthetic oil plants and the transportation network were destroyed. That aircraft was considered unsuitable for its primary mission by the organization responsible for procurement at the moment when it was most needed. This was not stupidity. It was a failure mode that recurs throughout the history of military procurement. The assessment of a new capability against the existing framework of what capabilities are supposed to look like. The P-51B was fast in a way that existing doctrine had not expected. It had range in a way that existing logistics assumptions had not accounted for. When you evaluated it against the standard American fighter models of 1942, the P-40, the P-38, the P-47, it fit uncomfortably into existing categories. The Merlin engine was British, manufactured under license by Packard, and the bureaucratic resistance to a foreign engine in an American aircraft was real. The laminar flow wing was new, its manufacturing tolerances demanding in ways that the production system was not yet prepared for. The institutional machinery of military procurement had been optimized for incremental improvements to existing designs, not for the kind of step-change capability that the Merlin Mustang represented. Doolittle's decision to let the P-51s hunt rather than escort is the tactical decision that the histories remember. The less celebrated decision, the one made at a level far below general officer rank by test pilots and engineers who kept flying the Merlin Mustang and sending results back to Washington and insisting, against institutional resistance, that the numbers were real, was in some ways more consequential. General Doolittle could change doctrine. He needed the aircraft to change doctrine with. The aircraft existed because people who understood what it could do refused to accept the institutional classification that said it was unsuitable. The other story inside the P-51 story is the drop tank, and what the drop tank reveals about how industrial capacity translates into military capability. A drop tank is not a sophisticated piece of technology. It is a container for fuel, attached to the wing of a fighter, jettisoned when empty. The manufacturing requirements are modest. The engineering challenges are real but not complex. The reasons that drop tanks in sufficient quantities did not reach the 8th Air Force's fighter groups before October 1943, before 60 B-17s did not come home from Schweinfurt, have nothing to do with the difficulty of making drop tanks. They have to do with priorities and procurement systems and the specific inertia of military logistics in a theater where 100 other requirements were all competing for the same manufacturing capacity and the same shipping tonnage. The drop tank arrived when it arrived because the losses at Schweinfurt made the cost of not having it undeniable. 600 men on October 14, 1943. That was the price of the delay. Whether that delay was avoidable, whether a different procurement decision in 1942, a different response to Eaker's requests in the summer of 1943, a different priority assigned to fighter range in the theater logistics plan, is a question that military historians have examined with the specific discomfort of people who know what the answer implies. The answer implies that the 60 aircraft lost over Schweinfurt were not simply the cost of fighting a war against a skilled and determined enemy. They were, in part, the cost of a bureaucratic and logistical failure that the Luftwaffe's gunnery merely executed. The P-51 arrived, the drop tanks arrived, the doctrine changed. The Luftwaffe died over its own territory in the spring of 1944, and on June 6, 1944, when the largest amphibious landing in history crossed the English Channel toward the beaches of Normandy, the Luftwaffe that had been the primary threat to Allied air superiority over the beach was not there. Not destroyed entirely, but so depleted, so stripped of the experienced pilots who could have disrupted the landing, that its intervention on D-Day was negligible. The Allied soldiers who crossed those beaches under air cover that held, that did not break under Luftwaffe attack, that maintained the air superiority over the landing zone that the planners had required, did not know what had produced that cover. They knew the aircraft flying overhead were American. They did not know the specific story of how those aircraft had been built, modified, rearmed, given longer legs, freed from the doctrine that had kept them tied to the bombers, and unleashed to hunt the pilots who would have threatened them. They did not know about Schweinfurt, or about the Merlin engine, or about the 4 pages Ronald Harker wrote in April 1942. They knew the beach. The beach was survivable because the sky was safe. The sky was safe because a Rolls-Royce test pilot had looked at an American airframe with the wrong engine and understood what it could become with the right one. The P-51 Mustang was produced in approximately 15,586 units between 1941 and 1945. Of those, approximately 8,156 were P-51Ds, the variant with the bubble canopy, the Packard Merlin V1650-7, and the fuel capacity to reach Berlin. Another 1,988 were P-51Bs, the Merlin-powered variant that first reached England in November 1943 and first appeared over Berlin in February 1944. The Luftwaffe that these aircraft destroyed had, in its prime, been the finest air force in the world. Its pilots had developed the tactics of aerial combat that every air force in the war eventually adopted: the rote and swarm formations, the free hunting missions, the coordinated interception procedures. They had fought over England in 1940 against a British Air Force that had inflicted unsustainable losses on them and ultimately denied them the air superiority the invasion of Britain required. By May 1944, the Luftwaffe was flying replacement pilots over Germany with 100 hours of training against P-51 pilots with 300. The math of attrition had been working against it for months, and the math was accelerating. Every experienced pilot killed was a pilot who could not be replaced on the timeline that the air battle required. Every replacement pilot who died in his first 3 missions, at the rate that replacement pilots were dying in the spring of 1944, was a pilot who had consumed training resources without returning anything to the institution that trained him. Galland, who had been commanding Luftwaffe fighter arm and watching the destruction of his force from inside it, eventually sent a report to Goering in May 1944 that described the situation with the controlled despair of a professional who had run out of optimistic assessments. The report stated that the Luftwaffe was losing pilots faster than the training system could produce them, that the quality of replacement pilots was declining as training times were compressed, and that without a fundamental change in the air situation, without removing the P-51 threat over Germany, the fighter arm would cease to exist as an effective force within months. Goering's response was to blame the pilots for lacking aggression. The pilots were not lacking aggression. They were lacking experience, fuel, and aircraft that could match what they were fighting. The experience problem was the P-51. The fuel problem was the strategic bombing of synthetic oil plants, a campaign that the P-51 escorts had made possible by defending the bombers that conducted it. The two problems were connected by the same aircraft flying from the same English bases. After the war, Albert Speer, the Reich Minister of Armaments who had managed German industrial production with extraordinary skill throughout the conflict, was interrogated extensively about which Allied actions had been most decisive against German war-making capacity. He mentioned the synthetic oil campaign. He mentioned the transportation campaign. He mentioned the bombing of the ball bearing industry, which had required repeated raids to have sustained effect. He was asked about the P-51 specifically. He said that the loss of experienced fighter pilots in the spring of 1944 had been a blow from which the Luftwaffe never recovered, and that the aircraft responsible for those losses had changed the entire character of the air war in a way that made subsequent Allied operations, the D-Day landing, the summer ground campaigns, the crossing of the Rhine, possible at costs that would not have been acceptable without it. The P-51 that the Material Division had classified as unsuitable for air superiority roles in March 1943 had produced the air superiority that D-Day required. The drop tank that the logistics system had not supplied in sufficient quantities before October 1943 had given that aircraft the range to use that air superiority over Germany rather than over the English Channel. The Merlin engine that a Rolls-Royce test pilot had recommended in 4 pages written in April 1942 had given the American airframe the high-altitude performance that made everything else possible. 3 things. None of them complicated. Each of them delayed by institutional processes that measured capability against existing frameworks rather than against what was required. The 60 B-17 over Schweinfurt on October 14, 1943, were the cost of those delays. The sky over the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, was what the delays had finally produced, after the accounting at Schweinfurt made the cost of further delay impossible to justify. The Mustang did not win the war alone. No aircraft, no weapon, no single capability wins a war alone. Wars are won by systems, and the system that won the air war over Europe in 1944 included the B-17s and B-24s and their crews, the P-47s and P-38s that had done the work before the Mustangs arrived, the radar networks and the ground controllers, and the logistics organizations that kept aircraft flying and fueled and armed. But the system had a limiting factor from the autumn of 1942 through the autumn of 1943, and that limiting factor was the range of the escort fighter. Until that limiting factor was removed, the strategic bombing campaign that was supposed to destroy Germany's ability to fight could not be sustained. Schweinfurt proved this. 60 B-17 in one day proved this. The P-51 removed the limiting factor. The solution that removed it had been available since the spring of 1942, when a Rolls-Royce test pilot flew an Allison Mustang at Duxford and wrote a report that identified what the airframe could become with a different engine. The problem he described and the answer he proposed were both available a year before Schweinfurt. The delay between identification and implementation cost 600 men on one October afternoon. The implementation, when it finally arrived, cost the Luftwaffe everything. Germany built the best fighter organization of the early war. America built the fighter that destroyed it, and the fighter that destroyed it was built for Britain, powered by a British engine, and identified as unsuitable by the organization that eventually fielded it. The Luftwaffe never understood why the flying fortresses had stopped coming home from Schweinfurt. They understood the aircraft. They saw the P-51 clearly enough. What they did not understand, could not understand until the attrition had already become irreversible, was that the aircraft was not just a better fighter. It was the resolution of a supply chain failure, the product of a test pilot's memo, the consequence of a Packard engine factory in Detroit producing British technology at American scale. It was a system solving a problem. The sky over Normandy on June 6, 1944, was empty of Luftwaffe aircraft. That emptiness was the system's output. 600 men over Schweinfurt had paid for it.